And what we discovered, and initially we thought this is something that could actually help patients that have Alzheimer's, removing plaque, helping the neurons.
Well, Ram, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Brandon, thank you for inviting me. This is really exciting. Quite honestly, I've never done a podcast.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited. I'm excited that you're making the time for us then.
Absolutely. Love to.
Yeah. For the audience, Ram's the CEO of IGC. IGC is doing some really interesting work in Alzheimer's. But Ram, I'll pass the floor over to you to tell us a little bit about your career and how you got started here.
Well, it's interesting. My career, I'm an engineer and I went to the University of Maryland. I studied engineering and I studied mathematics. So I have a pretty strong STEM background. And, back, and this is 40 years ago. So I started off in electrical in engineering. I studied electrical engineering. But by the time I graduated, I had taken a lot of classes in mathematics. I'd also done a lot of work in biomedical engineering. So in a lot of ways, this is coming full circle because for me, even though initially started in telecom, and then from telecom, I sort of went into, looking at different things in construction, and then I ended up in this area, which is essentially where all my biomedical engineering that I studied many, many, many years ago is sort of come to bear. So it's a very exciting time for me, quite honestly, because of that.
Yeah. And how how did you go from telco infrastructure and then into the world of drug development? That's those are three very different domains.
So we started in, when I started IGC, we were looking at construction. And what we really wanted to do was the cannabis industry in America had just started and it was just starting to flourish. And a lot of the problem that we discovered is that a lot of people that had licenses, they couldn't get infrastructure. So they couldn't get a place to have a shop or to do distillation or to extraction or any of that. And because landlords were worried about their leases and things like that. So what we decided to do was try and see if we could build infrastructure for that industry. And that's really how we sort of got into that space. And it turned out that building infrastructure in that space wasn't really something that we could do for a variety of reasons, mainly because we were a public company and we couldn't really be in the cannabis space. So we started looking at what cannabis could do. And one of the things that we worked on early on was pain. So we looked at THC, we looked at CBD, we looked at how it could alleviate pain. And we got very excited because the medical potential was huge. And one thing sort of led to another. And one of our advisors said, hey, since you're working on these kinds of medical problems and looking at the cannabis space, why did you go talk to these people at the University of South Florida? And so we flew down there, and there's a particular researcher there, Dr. Chow. He was working for about 7 years on using THC, of all things, not CBD, THC, the psychoactive compound in cannabis. And he was testing it on Alzheimer's cell lines and also Alzheimer's mouse models, animal models. And what he had discovered and published, and we sort of, that's when we got super interested in the Alzheimer's space, is that he had so much research that he had done that actually showed that certain molecules within certain cannabinoids could actually be used to reduce the plaque burden in the brain of an Alzheimer's patient. So one thing sort of led to another. And that's how we ended up in this space. We licensed that technology from the University of South Florida, USF, And then we develop that into a drug. It takes years to sort of go from preclinical work to actually having a drug. But that's how we ended up with the drug that we thought could work on Alzheimer's patients. And then we started testing that.
Yeah. And tell me more about this drug.
So this drug is a liquid formulation. And what he discovered was that very, very low doses of THC, ultra dose of THC, is something that is very different from high doses of THC. So THC is biphasic, meaning that at low doses it does one thing, and at high doses it does something completely different. I'll give you an example. At high doses, it destroys mitochondria, which is the power pack in a cell. That's where energy comes from in a cell. At very low doses, at ultra low dosing, it does exactly the opposite. It actually enhances mitochondrial output. Now, in Alzheimer's, mitochondria is something that individuals with Alzheimer's, there's a lack of mitochondria in their nerve cells, in their neurons. So that's an area that we're looking at. It also what he was able to also show is that this is that THC with in combination with another molecule was able to reduce beta amyloid. So in Alzheimer's, what happens is a couple of different hallmarks of Alzheimer's, right? You have in the brain, you have neurons. Well, let's say you have two or three, millions of neurons. Plaque or sticky protein develop in the brain and they deposit between these neurons. And so it cuts off the circuitry and so it cuts off memory. That's one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's. The other thing that happens is that the scaffolding within a neuron breaks down and the neuron itself dies. So when neurons start dying, your brain shrinks. You lose not only do you lose connectivity, but you actually lose cognitive ability as well. So Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease and it's progressive. Today, there is no cure for Alzheimer's. And so what he discovered in cell lines is that this is something that removes beta amyloid plaque. Plaque is what it deposited between neurons, and it removes that. And it also helps the scaffolding within a neuron to hold, which means that the neuron itself is alive. And he also discovered that at ultra low dosing in combination with other molecules, it's able to help mitochondria. It's able to regenerate mitochondria. Three incredible discoveries. So we took that and we created a drug substance. And what we discovered, and initially we thought this is something that could actually help patients that have Alzheimer's, removing plaque, helping the neurons. But when we took this to a phase one study, and a phase one study is something that you do when you want to test the safety of the molecule, right? That's a typical in drug development. You do the preclinical work on cell lines, and then you move on to mouse models or to animal models and show that it works in an animal model. And then you go to human trials. And in the human trials, phase one is where you show that it's safe. So we were able to show that our medication, which is a liquid formulation, is safe at three different doses. If you take it once a day, if you take it twice a day, or you take it three times a day, the adverse events from these are very low. So we were able to establish that it was safe. Now, what happened is that in that trial, we also looked at patients and we looked at neuropsychiatric symptoms that are associated with Alzheimer's. We looked at anxiety, agitation, depression. We looked at irritability, sleep disorders, all of these things that accompany an Alzheimer's patient. So as the disease progresses, not only do you lose memory, but all of these other sort of neuropsychiatric symptoms start to develop and start to really become bad. Of those, one of them, like agitation, is very critical because Think about a patient that's being taken care of, your grandmother or or your parent being taken care of by someone, and that individual becomes very agitated. And I'm not talking about road rage or not talking about episodic agitation. This is chronic agitation. It's brought about by neuroinflammation in the brain. But plaque gets deposited, there's neuroinflammation in the brain, and the person gets it's a chronic agitation. And agitation is described as a whole bunch of behaviors. For example, someone that's verbally agitated, shouting, yelling, screaming, chronic, or physical agitation, person throwing things, hitting people, biting people, or if
Mm.
you put some food on the table, the person might, throw all the food on the floor. So that kind of physically aggressive behavior. But there's a lot more to agitation. It's not just those two. There's also pacing, an individual that is constantly pacing back and forth, or motor movements, opening and closing a drawer, constantly doing that, wandering, leaving the house, trying to get out, opening locks and just leaving. That's another form of agitation. So these are all symptoms that Alzheimer's patients go through, and caregivers have an extraordinarily hard time dealing with this
Sure.
because, you try and feed a patient and
Yeah.
he throws the food away or throws it at you or tries to, accuse you of trying to poison the individual. It's a very, very difficult set of behaviors that the patient, has to endure. And when the patient goes through it, the caregiver also suffers. So their
Mhm.
family members suffer. And the inevitability is that the individual is dosed with antipsychotics or medications that just sedate the patient. So there's really no other way of dealing with this currently. It leads to separation of families. Families have to end up, putting the person in a nursing home or getting help, which is very expensive, very difficult to deal with for the caregiver. But for the patient, what happens is this agitation also leads to an acceleration of cognitive decline. So increased medications, or acceleration of cognitive decline, and you also have a separation of families. So, and you also have expenses. It becomes very expensive to manage a patient like that. So, what we found was that our medication was able to reduce agitation and make the patient a lot more manageable without is completely sedating them and having them just lie on a sofa all day.
And this is a low dose of THC?
This is what I call an ultra low dose of THC plus another molecule in a liquid formulation.
Mm. Gotcha.
It's the combination that works. And that's what was shown by USF. It's that combination that really works synergistically. And if you have this other molecule, you don't need, a higher dose. And if you were to give the patient a higher dose, you're talking about people that are 80 years old.
Mhm.
Right? They could they get high, they're gonna fall.
Mhm.
High risk. And falling, breaking the hip, breaking something, it's a very high risk of fall. So that's why the synergy is very important. It allows us to keep the dosing of THC extremely low.
Gotcha. And this is it's an oral formulation, so, I assume it's like a few drops on the tongue, like, once a day or something? Is that the idea?
Yeah, it's generally that's the concept, but it's a liquid formulation. So you take 1 milliliter of it.
Mm. Wow.
It's like one dropper, right? You could take it directly, which is what most patients do, or you could also put it in orange juice and drink it. If the pain is too difficult, right? You can put it in their orange juice, but it's a liquid formulation.
Yeah. Hey, in many ways, it kind of feels like this, the kind of trend around cannabis, came and went, and, uh, I think with legalization has been, a little bit less, uh I guess, pursued like pharmacologically. Curious, like how has your experience been like continuing to develop a program in a broader landscape that has become maybe like less excited over the last few years?
Well, it's less exciting um, if you're purely into cannabis,
Mm.
but we're not. So, you know, I don't want to be called a cannabis company,
Yeah.
right? Because that's not what we are. We're a pharmaceutical company that's using a molecule that the cannabis plant produces. Give you an example, aspirin, right? Came out of willow bark. It was extracted from that. So while the willow bark might not be that exciting, aspirin is very exciting. So for us, we sort of look at it as we're not a cannabis company. We're not selling cannabis. We're not even promoting cannabis. We're neutral on that. But our medication, which is an ultra low dose of THC, has been extraordinarily difficult for us to develop. Extremely difficult. You have all kinds of federal regulations. You have banking regulations. Even though it's an ultra low dose, even explaining this to bankers is very difficult. What really saved our company is the 2018 Farm, where the 2018 Farm Bill sort of drew a distinction between hemp and marijuana. You remember that? And hemp is described or defined in that Farm Bill as a plant, as the cannabis plant that contains THC less than 0.3%. So if you have THC that's more than 0.3%, you're considered marijuana. And all of the marijuana regulations come in, which is, making it federally illegal. You have to get a license, all of that. If it's less than 0.3%, then that plant is legal federally. Just it's not, they're both called cannabis, but one is marijuana and the other is hemp. Hemp is legal in America. Marijuana is not, right? But and our medication comes from hemp. It has THC, but it's derived from hemp. And in the final medication, the THC content is below the 0.3%. So it's completely legal. It's not even a controlled substance, which is what's exciting. Now, had the hemp bill not come into place, we would still be dealing with marijuana legalization and marijuana laws, and every patient that we gave this to would have to go to a dispensary, or it would be significantly more complicated. Because of that farm bill, we were able to actually move forward much faster. And it was because of that we were able to sort of shift our focus from marijuana to hemp. And we grew hemp in Arizona. And we had a we had to actually get the licenses, which we did. And then we grew hemp. And then we extracted the THC from hemp. And that's what goes into our medication. So it's completely legal flow. But
Gotcha.
still explaining that to bankers is, oh, you got THC, so you must be in the marijuana. Right. It's still very difficult.
Yeah. Well, a bunch of fascinating similarities with some of the psychedelic work that is currently very exciting.
It is very exciting. The psychedelic work is very exciting. We actually are also looking at it, but it seems that doing work in psychedelics is a little bit easier because banks don't seem to be as hung up on THC and marijuana and CBD and all that. So it's a very exciting area, and some of the research that I've seen on psychedelics is just unbelievable. Especially with depression and with anxiety and with the PTSD, and it's just mind blowing what's going on.
Certainly. What do we know today about the real mechanism of action for how THC um, works with agitation in Alzheimer's.
Well, the problem is that there really is no, you know, if you ask me, how does THC, um, work on agitation? I would say there's about 3, 4 different things that I would tell you. One of them is that there's a linkage between there's a receptor called the CB1 receptor, which is what THC binds to. And in Alzheimer's patients, what happens is the number of receptors and their propensity decreases considerably. So in Alzheimer's brain, THC is the CB1 receptors are reduced. So what THC is able to do is it's able to bind to these receptors. So there are a lot of studies that show that if you look at a mouse model of Alzheimer's and you take out the CB1 receptors from that mouse, essentially what happens is that the mouse gets very aggressive. So it's called a knockout mouse model, and in that knockout mouse model, what you see is aggressive behavior. So there is a linkage between that. So THC binds to these receptors, and THC is able to sort of, by binding to this, it's able to reduce agitation. So that's one of the mechanisms. The second mechanism is that it reduces hyperactivity in the neural circuit, and it's able to calm irritability and agitation and aggression. It also modulates neurotransmitters. So this is what we sort of say is that our medication is able to attack agitation 3 different ways. One is CB1 receptors. The other is by reducing neuroinflammation, and then the third is by modulating neurotransmitters. So dopamine and serotonin, for example, it's something which influence mood and behavior. It's able to rebalance these neurotransmitters. Those are sort of the mechanism. We also have another molecule in our formulation, and it's melatonin. And melatonin is something that's been known to also do these things. It's a anti-inflammatory. It's able to reduce inflammation. So synergistically, what it allows us to do is keep the dosing very low. If you had one or the other, you'd have very high doses, and melatonin can lead to sedation. As you know, one of the things that we've discovered in our phase 2 program is that Alzheimer's patients, this is known, Alzheimer's patients have trouble sleeping. And there's something called sundown syndrome, where there's a reversal of sleep pattern. Now, we're not saying that our medication can help with sundown syndrome, but what we've noticed is that it it's amazing at allowing the patient to actually get a good night's rest. So the number of sleep disturbances in the patient reduces. So sleep is also something that's helped. So our medication is able to help patients sleep.
And are you it sounds like you're similarly playing with the dosages of, melatonin. Is it also an ultra light is that ultra low dose or
Both are very, very low doses.
fascinating? So presumably given the combination here of THC and melatonin, which are pretty widely understood, from a safety perspective, this feels, um, uh more similar to the kind of like realm of understanding than dissimilar.
It is, and you're absolutely right. But the combination is something that hasn't been studied. So
Fascinating.
individually, each of them has been studied, but that combination hasn't been studied. So we still have to go through and show, for example, that the combination is not genotoxic, that it doesn't, create toxicity in your genes. It doesn't, and prolonged use of this doesn't lead to toxicity or to other kinds of damage, right? So we still have to go through and do all of those things. So it's not quite as simple as just taking these two. Oh, they're known. Let's put it together for a molecule, and we have something that can work. Um, Surprisingly, melatonin, as you know, has been used for very long time, but there really aren't that many tox studies on it. There are, so it hasn't really been as a pharmaceutical. That no one's really gone through and done all of that. So we have to still go through and do tox studies for melatonin. We still have to do, prove to the FDA that even at this dosing, that it's safe when it's taken over time.
Yeah,
And then, of course, we have to prove that the combination is something that that is safe also.
yeah,
So even though they've been studied, we still have to go through all of the.
of course, of course. And before we were recording here, we were just talking about um, the kind of realities of doing clinical research and doing clinical trials. Maybe talk to me about the kind of program that you have running today and uh, some of the challenges you're kind of facing and how you're addressing them.
So, Brandon, we were talking about patient recruitment. Um, if you back up a little bit, Alzheimer's impacts we're dealing with what's called late onset Alzheimer's as opposed to early onset Alzheimer's. 90% of all Alzheimer's is late onset. So the symptoms, even though you get this plaque that I talked about, that deposit between neurons, you get it 20 years before any symptoms appear. So in your 40s, you might get this. And then you sort of, by the time you get to your 60s, that's when the symptoms come in. And that's really when, all of this, um, the cognition, the memory lapses and decrease in cognition, all that starts. So our patients are over 65. Now, women are affected more than men. So 60, I think 66% or 63% of all Alzheimer's patients are women. So when we have a trial on agitation, we're looking for a patient that is not completely sedated, lives at home with a caregiver, and is someone that can come to the clinic 3 or 4 times maximum. It's not, you come in every day. It's you come in at baseline, you come in at week 2, week 4, week 6. That's it. And week 4 is optional. It can even be over video. So when you go out, that's the patient that we're looking for. Highly agitated, has had agitation for a period of 2 weeks at least, is on some stable medication, and that patient then has to come in for to join the tribe. Now it's difficult because if we were just doing Alzheimer's patients, it would be a little bit easier, not a whole lot. But when you're looking specifically for agitation, it's a little bit hard. And we have a couple of different techniques that we're using. We do Facebook ads, and that's starting to work. We are in 22 different um, clinical sites. We are in Florida, we are in New York, we are in 2 or 3 sites in Canada. We're in Montreal, we're in Toronto, we are here in Maryland, where we are. So and we're in Puerto Rico. We are at the University of Puerto Rico. We're going to start 2 more sites in Colombia, South America. But that's really where we are today. We are in about 22 different sites. And patients, the whole patient recruitment is it's hard. It's
Yeah.
time consuming. It's difficult. It's you have to have a conversation with the patient and at least with the caregiver, because typically the patient really isn't in a position to say, "Oh, I'm agitated. I want to join this trial." It's the caregiver. So we have to have a conversation with the caregiver.
Yeah. Uh, I imagine that working with patients who are experiencing agitation like this presents its own set of challenges with adherence and uh, like willingness to participate. Can you tell me a little bit about uh, how you address those?
So what we did was we have, you know, I think 5 interns that we hired. And this is something we just rolled out about a month ago. We hired interns that are, you know, they're very compassionate. They're in healthcare. They want to go to medical school or they want to study. They want to get a master's in public health. So what we do is we advertise. We have videos running on Facebook. Someone sees the video. It's an explanation on agitation, what our trial is, and so on. And they fill out a form. And then we have a group that calls them and then sort of explains what the trial is, explains to them how many visits there are, what is expected, what they can expect on day one, what they can expect on on the second visit, how the evaluations will be done. So they walk them through the entire trial and sort of convince them that this is something that A could help research, B could potentially help them too. One of the issues is there's a 50% chance that you're going to get the medication. Half of the patients get placebo. So we have to walk them through that and explain what that means. We're trying to introduce in an open label at the end of the trial so that everyone gets the medication, can benefit from the medication. We also tell them about what we saw in phase one, the safety profile. So we really had it's a conversation, and it's a conversation with individuals that are individuals that are not in a good place, right? These are individuals that have to deal with a patient, could be a spouse, could be a sibling that, or a parent that has Alzheimer's. There's no medication for Alzheimer's. There's no cure for Alzheimer's today. There are two approved medications that can sort of, help with early onset of, or not early onset of Alzheimer's, but with uh, early stage of Alzheimer's.
Mm.
But there's really nothing that works quickly for agitation. And what we've discovered is compared to the existing medication, our medication can work very quickly. The existing antipsychotics take about 6 weeks to build up in your system before they can start working. Ours works, days, or certainly we have a very clean data that shows that it works in 2 weeks. But
Wow.
it even works much significantly faster than that.
Wow. Wow. Well, I for one am really excited to continue watching how the this phase two program you have progresses. And I know that a lot of the folks listening in are going to be excited to see some of that continued data read out. Maybe my last question for you, because you kind of alluded.
Before you get the last, I have something else with you. There are, as I said initially, there are 400 million people with plaque built up in their brains. Now, in order to diagnose them, you need a PET scan, which a lot of these people don't have access. And also, they go to doctors who are general practitioners who may not recognize all the symptoms. And so there's a very high level of false negatives. So patient or with the caregiver walks in, oh, my mom is, forgetting stuff. My mom doesn't remember things. She wanders. And what happens is that the general practitioner sort of says, oh, it's part of aging. This is normal. Nothing we can do. So diagnosing Alzheimer's is difficult. You need a PET scan, you need a blood biomarker, or you have to have spinal tap to get um, CNS fluid. But what we're doing is we're taking data from 100 different databases from about 20 different countries, and we're developing a foundation AI model that can help a doctor diagnose the patient. It's a physician's tool. So when the patient walks in, the doctor is able to input information about the patient, information about where the patient lives, what the demographics are, what the family history is. No, it doesn't. You don't need the PET scan. You put in all of the other information. Things like even diet, maybe too much sugar in the diet. So once you put all that information in, what the model will do is the model will stratify the individual and tell the doctor this person is at a low risk of Alzheimer's, which means this person forgetting this stuff, might not be Alzheimer's related. or a moderate level, which means the symptoms that they're describing could have a moderate or a high propensity or a high risk of getting Alzheimer's. And left untreated, this individual's cognitive ability will decline over the next 2, 3 years, and it'll give you a score as to what would happen over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's a very powerful tool that a doctor could use, and we're developing this, and we've sort of, the model is working. We're very excited. This is something that we can deploy, that doctors can actually use, and we hope that it can help this 400 million people that have, a risk factor for Alzheimer's. And there are things you can do. So it's not that you diagnose and there's no medication. Gee, what do I do now? There are lots of things you can do. 40% of Alzheimer's or 40% of dementia can be delayed.
Wow.
Exercise, diet, a social interaction, cardiovascular, if you've got cardiovascular issues, if you've got diabetes, something can be done. So there are things that you can do to delay the onset. And that's what we're focused on. We're not saying that, oh, there's no medication, so what's the point? There is a point. There is a point to diagnosing, because if you are at risk, there are steps that you can take to prevent, to delay, and to improve. And the whole idea is if you can delay, for the next 5 years, there'll be medication that comes along.
Yeah.
So we're very excited with this AI model, and it's if AI hadn't come along, we wouldn't be able to do it. So
Yeah. Incredible work. Love to see you pushing the envelope on the diagnostic side as well. That's very exciting.
yeah, thank you. We're very excited.
Um, okay. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak. Maybe I'll throw you my last question here. Would love to hear. Would love to hear one thing you wish that bankers uh, could change their mind on, with regard to um, uh, cannabinoid-based or hemp-based products, like yours. You mentioned that maybe there's still some stigma there. I'm curious, if you had to bust a myth for them, what would it be?
Well, I think that bankers really need to take, they need to look at they do a risk analysis at the end of the day. And they need to look at hemp versus marijuana. And they cannot treat marijuana and hemp together, because the 2018 Farm Bill very clearly draws the line and says anything on this side is hemp and is federally legal. So, from a federal perspective, the banker has no risk. But if it's marijuana, from a federal perspective, there is risk. So,
Sure.
if there's one thing I would encourage bankers to do, is to look at that and say this company is clearly dealing with hemp. And so for us, or for the banker, there's no risk. And, he should give, they should, we've had our bank accounts closed by at least 7 or 8 banks.
Wow.
We open the account, everything is fine. And then one day, bank account's closed. And in a rush, we have to move stuff. So that's a big problem for us. Our investors have trouble depositing shares in some of the, in some of the brokerages, because they say, oh, IGC is a marijuana company. But we're listed on the NYSE American, and NYSE and NASDAQ don't list marijuana companies.
Yeah.
So, but even that distinction is just completely lost, so difficult for us because of this. And I wish they would sort of stop and see that, you know, we're not in the marijuana business, the hemp business. We're listed on one of the big boards, and they don't list marijuana companies. Just
Yeah.
that explanation should be enough for them to, to take our stock, as well as to give us banks to say.
Yeah. Well, for the banks that are listening, not that there are many,
Right.
now you know. Now you know. Stop giving IGC a hard time.
Exactly. Brandon, thank you.
Yeah, of course. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for taking the time to have this talk with me.
Thanks, Brandon. It was very, very enjoyable. Thank you.
Of course.